Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fourth panel of our Civil Society Sharing Screen series. This series is funded by the European Union. In this series, we bring together civil society professionals, academics, specialists, human rights activists, and talk about topical issues to do with civil society. You can see the panel series, explanation about the panels, the dates, and the guests on the website of the foundation. We're going to keep updating the information with the new guests in the upcoming days. So we'd like to see you again with us in the continuation of this series as well. We would like to ask you a question before we start the event. And the question is, what comes to mind when you think about grassroots movements? You can share your answers on the chat box with us. And you can always post your comments in the chat box as well. Today we're going to be talking about the grassroots movements and civil society's future. And the title of the panel is Rebuilding the Civic Space, Changing Faces. We have with us from Namibia, Bertha Tobias, who was a pioneer of the Shut It All Down protests against the violence against women in Namibia. Also, the general coordinator of Leonid Drapkin, the general coordinator of OVD Info. Also, we have with us Bosphorus University graduate and activist Furkan Dabaniaste, as well as San Diego University Peace Studies faculty member Philip Gamargellian. The moderator will be Ali Bayramoğlu. I would like to welcome him as well and leave the floor to him. Could you please unmute yourself, Mr. Bayramoğlu? I believe I'm on at the moment. Hello, everyone, once again. Of course, the panel today is on grassroots movements that develop spontaneously, organically at times, through creative ways, innovative ways. And we're going to be talking about civil action, civic action through grassroots movements. I'd like to first of all mention before we start that about 25 years ago, the Helsinki Citizens Association together with an American human rights organization developed projects that are working on innovative ways of human rights advocacy rather than traditional ways. They started a project. In order to be able to do that, we went to Africa on that project. We went to Asia. So we were focusing on projects that are linked to the human rights organizations that are not linked to the human rights organizations, but rather spurn on their own volition. And about 400 people, 400 participants were involved in the project in a symposium. So I had the sense back then, and I have the same sense at the moment as well, that we live in a very dynamic world. Civic space, the civil area is being restructured constantly, is expanding, is rebuilding itself. But the challenges of this dynamic world are also as intense. Therefore, the relation between these problems and this dynamic development spurns grassroots movements, and we see this everywhere. I'm not going to keep it long Today, this is the issue that we're going to be talking about. We have 3 representatives of this area and 1 specialist. Ebro has already introduced them. So I'd like to start with Bertha. Let's get to know each other, first of all. Bertha, can you tell us how the Shut It All Down protests against gender-based violence started in Namibia? And could you please also talk about how you got involved?
Right.
This is the first question, so if you could answer this in about 3 minutes, and this is also relevant for all the other speakers as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Awesome. First of all, thank you so much. I think this is an incredibly important platform. It's an incredibly important conversation that we need to be having. So my name is Bertha Tobias. Very briefly, I'm from Namibia. I'm a student of international relations in California, currently at home, and also a gender-based violence activist. So the way the Shut It All Down protests began was in April of 2020, there was a young woman by the name of Shannon Wasserfall who went missing. So later that year, that was around October, one of the national newspapers reported that there were human remains that were found in a desert in Namibia. So it was then later confirmed that the remains belonged to this young woman. So the contextual framework is that Namibia already generally experiences a lot of gender-based violence. We are in a femicide pandemic. So what the death of Shannon did is it just pushed us all off the edge. So within a matter of about 24 hours, young people came together, they mobilized, they organized themselves, and they said they're going to demonstrate. So what we saw then was a series of 3 protests against gender-based violence with a combined social and non-social reach of about 11 million. Which is massive, considering that we have a population of 2 million. So we shut down the Central Business District, Zoo Park, the biggest mall in Namibia. But the bottom line was just that young people in Namibia disrupted significant national operations in the name of saying we're tired of gender-based violence and we're tired of femicide. How I got involved, I was one of the organizers. Obviously, it's a bit difficult and even dangerous to say these things out loud. But I organized, I contributed to mobilization, and did what I could, just like all other young Namibian people. But that's Shut It All Down in a nutshell.
Am I on at the moment? Can you hear me? Yes. So I'd like to ask Leonid the same question as a matter of fact. Leonid, you're working in the movement called Ovid Info in Russia. Please assume that we have no idea about it, and please tell us generally about it, the establishment story behind it, and what you've been doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I guess you can hear me well. So OVD info, so the first 3 letters of this OVD is translated from Russian as like police station, which so mainly you can translate the name of our organization as police station, information about police station. And we were established around 10 years ago. And initially it was just a Facebook post. So in 2011, there were elections in Russia to our parliament that everyone considered to be not really fair. So, and it was very, very mass protest. And this was the time when police took many people off the street and sent them to police station. And the situation was that nobody knew where their relatives, where their friends. Mobile phones was not that developed, so not everyone didn't know what's going on with their close friends. And so our co-founder posted on Facebook just, okay, guys, if anyone knows something, please comment on this post. And many people who were like in one police station started posting names and family names of those who is now at this police station or that police station. And It was a kind of crowdsourcing thing. And other guys, well, relatives, mothers, friends, they started just reading this. And this was very important. And we realized that this information is really missing. And so once the information got well known, then everyone feels safer. That's why our motto is information protects. So we believe that the more information is distributed, the safer the situation for the one who is being detained. So now we are way more bigger than just a Facebook post. So our organization is like 70%, and we have our hotline, big Telegram bot, and we got dozens of calls every day. And so what we do is, first of all, we collect information from different sources and from our hotline 24/7 and from Telegram bot, where you can text us about the detention. So we mainly work with freedom of assembly, but also with other civic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of association, and some electoral rights. So first of all, we collect some information, and then we help people in two ways. First of all, we publish news. And that's why we are not only human rights organization, we are human rights media organization, because so we publish many news and our website is very popular. And the second thing is direct legal help. So we provide people with lawyers to courts. We help them to apply to European Court for Human Rights. And many things around this. And just to be very short, I want to tell that we try to help to particular people who already faced the political prosecutions. However, we also work more systematically, and we try to change the situation and as a whole. And we do some advocacy campaigns, and so we try to we do enlightenment, and so we want to change the whole situation and not to cure the patients. So that's more or less like this.
Thank you very much, Leonid. Now it's Furkan's turn. We have a lot of participants from abroad, Furkan. We know about what you've been doing in Turkey, as a matter of fact, and we have monitored them very closely. But for us and for all the participants, could you please also tell us about how the process started, how it expanded, how it became stronger? All right, yes, of course. Can you hear me first of all? Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to greet everybody who's trying to make the world a better place. As you might remember, on the 2nd of January, the presidency, the government of Turkey, appointed a rector to the Bosphorus University. And when this appointee rector came on, new faculties were opened in the Bosphorus University, like the communication faculty, for example, and also the appointed management of the university used multiple votes to change the structure of the Bosphorus University. Also, several demonstrations have taken place in the 5 months since then, and the Bosphorus University rectorship tried to disrupt that student movement. The LGBT club, for example, was shut down. Then students were detained. Police cracked down on students' homes. Also, disciplinary measures were taken in the university as well. And therefore, the rights of many students have been violated. And also, the police violence didn't stop there. They also increased the number of the CCTV cameras around the school as well, so that they could follow them, they could monitor them very closely. Also, they don't allow graduate students into the school. I was one of the founders of the LGBTI club. With the shutdown of the LGBTI club on the 1st of February, there was a police crackdown on the Bosphorus University, and because the club was founded as well, was shut down as well, I couldn't really remain silent. Therefore, I started broadcasting about this event with the hashtag resist Boğaziçi, resist Bosphorus on Clubhouse, and I had the opportunity to reach everyone who was interested in this. We have open forum rooms on Clubhouse, and as Leonid said, information is really important, and I believe that the communication, the information that is coming from the civil society organization is very important as well. Also, we have to make sure, we have to verify that the information is coming from the right resources too. Therefore, we established a platform on Clubhouse. We broadcast news, broadcast information coming directly from those who experienced these events in the Bosphorus University. We have reached 200,000 people up until now, and we still continue on with this initiative as a resist Boğaziçi. I could just sum it up like this, I believe. Thank you very much, Furkan. So each speaker, we knew already about what they've been doing as a matter of fact, but we still wanted to hear their own words as well. Philip Gamargellian is going to be with us a little bit later. Therefore, is that right, Ebru? He's not with us at the moment, right? No, he's not. All right, then I'll ask him the question later on then. Now let's go to the heart of the beast. We're going to have two sections. In the first section, the question is, so these grassroots movements that are more spontaneous, that are more creative, these movements, first of all, are separate, are different from traditional movements, but how are they different? In what respect are they different? For example, the actions that you've been involved in, the activities that you've conducted, how are they different from the traditional structures, from the traditional institutional settings in your own experience? So could you please answer that question? We can go through with the same order again. So Bertha, Tobias, the word is yours, first of all.
Awesome.
You have 7 minutes this time.
Oh, 7. And I'm guessing that's 7 for both parts of the question, correct? Yeah? Yes, for the whole question at the moment. So awesome. You have 7 minutes at the moment. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Okay, where do I start? So firstly, I think it's important for context as I answer the question to highlight the fact that Shut It All Down was primarily youth-led. So there were young people who decided to come together and confront, challenge, and interrogate institutions that we felt were failing us as far as gender-based violence is concerned. But more importantly, it was a very specific demographic of young people. And this is important because young people can be involved in governance and advocacy in different ways. So you have young people who are part of traditional structures. For example, in Namibia, there are young people who are, under the age of 25, under the age of 30, who are parliamentarians, who are involved in policy formulation and implementation. And it's important then to outline that those are not the young people who are involved in the protests. It was primarily young people whose voices for long periods of time have been relegated to the margins. It was young people who don't have any decision-making or legislative executive power. Young people who are typically not heard, who don't have traditional or credible platforms to express themselves other than Twitter. So with that in mind, that movement was different from other movements that we've seen in Namibia that were championed and had the endorsement of all young people or of all groups. So what it means that the kinds of young people who were championing Shut It All Down were your radical activists, your radical queer people, your radical Pan-Africanist young types, meant that even the movement and the protests in themselves were very volatile. They were very expressive. You could almost say they were very culturally or artistically violent. What does that mean? So that means that all kinds of expression that were taking place were very explosive, right? So young people went in front of the parliament, for example, and that's where they laid down the petition. There was a lot of confrontation, for example, on day 3 between young people and the police officers, because they were dancing and they were dancing to explicit music, to vulgar music, and the traditional systems of democracy and the institution which upholds the laws in Namibia. That's particularly the Namibian police and the city police. That was uncomfortable. And that is something that is fundamentally different, I think, from other protests that we've seen, where there have been stakeholders that are also part of traditional cultural structures, right? And then an important question also that I'd really, I think something else that I'd also like to highlight, and I think you can still hear me, I think I'm still fine, is the points that distinguish sort of civil movements, I think, from grassroots movements, or what distinguishes Shut It All Down particularly from everything else that we've seen, is that Shut It All Down didn't have funding. There was no traditional sustainable source of funding or support to continue, right? We were operating from a second-hand Volkswagen Polo car and megaphones that we've borrowed and posters that we asked for and banners that people just decided to sponsor and donate. But it was easily one of the most effective, one of the most impactful movements that we've seen and that we continue to see until date. And I think what that does is it speaks to the culture and the power of young people coming together and people, chipping in for a cause that we all believe in. So what you'll see, for example, with a lot of civil society organizations in Namibia is that they have a formal structure, right? They are registered, they have some kind of brand or some kind of legal identity that is attached to the work that they do. And what that means is they also have the credibility then to do the work that they do. Because with those structures, you're able to have technical expertise. You're able to have legal representation as an organization. For Shut It All Down, that's not the case. It was young people working from their heart and from their soul spontaneously. So for example, on day 3 of the protests, there were a lot of confrontations between the protesters and the police. And this is it's a situation that's got a lot of international attention from CNN, from BBC, from Al Jazeera, etc. But what I'm trying to point out is that on that day, there were 25 young people who were unlawfully arrested and a lot more who were beaten and who were tear gassed. What do you do when there's no structural accountability, when we don't have lawyers for Shut It All Down who we can call for legal representation? Because we don't have that brand identity. But more importantly, when a movement is faceless and it's leaderless, who do you call to bail out 25 young people who were arrested while protesting? So that all made it very structurally challenging for all of us. But what we saw there were actually leaders and lawyers. Some of the best lawyers in Namibia, about 7 of the best lawyers in Namibia came together and they said, among the 7 of us, we are going to provide that legal counsel that you all need. And that's because we didn't have access to that as an organization. So I think that lack of structure also made us less prone to being co-opted by government or being co-opted by institutions that were trying to silence our voices or were trying to put out the flame. Because when you don't have a structure, anybody can represent Shut It All Down at any meeting, and anybody can say anything without, significant consequences. Because what we're claiming as a movement is that the movement belongs to anyone and everyone. And what that does is it also gives everybody the chance to associate themselves or dissociate themselves from the movement as far as they want. So just to sum it up, as I get to the end of my 7 minutes, importantly, what distinguished Shut It All Down? One, there were no set leaders. There was no one leading. Obviously there are people who are consistently the face of the protests, but that person wasn't a leader, and we tried to make that very clear. So there was that lack of structure, there was that lack of organizational resource or access to counsel or anything like that. But more importantly, it was led by a very specific demographic of young people who are tired and who continue, in fact, to kind of spark a national conversation. And we think why that difference was important and why that specific demographic of young people was important is the very fact that now Shut It All Down has opened up a space in Namibia in national dialogue and discourse, which sends the very strong message that young people have the capacity to contribute to discourse and to dialogue, and they have the capacity to direct it in whatever way they want to direct it, and they have the capacity and the responsibility almost to demand some kind of accountability from government, or to demand some kind of accountability from any structure which is supposed to be providing social service delivery that is effective and meaningful for the people of Namibia.
Berta, thank you very much. This has been a very clear representation of a movement of the community, Unnamed Youth, that started such an important movement with results besides everything else. Now, I'd like to ask the very same question to Leonid. So we're talking about movements that come from the society, that are grassroots movements, that do they have any advantage over other more conventional, traditional types of movements? What are the lessons you drew from your experiences? How would you wrap it up for us in 7 to 8 minutes?
Yeah, thank you very much. So as I told in my first part of what I was telling, it was initially just a Facebook post. And now, and the next in 2011 and 2012, 13, it was, our organization was just a volunteer project. Of course, at one point of time, we got some funding and that stuff. And now there are 70 employees in our organization. However, it's not only us. There are still hundreds or even thousands of volunteers that help us. And this shows that even though it's been 10 years and our organization developed quite significantly, so we still stick to our principles, to our roots, and we still believe in it. And because we have volunteers and this is our basis, but what I wanted to say more globally is that our organization, of course, we have some goals, short-term goals, long-term goals, but the most important thing that we have is our values, because goals can change over time. Goals can change because of the environment, political situation, and whatever. But our values never changes. And I think this is what allows us to grow and to make people trust us, because our community is very, very broad, and mainly not because people believe in our tools that we apply, not because people see our effectiveness, or because of this as well. But however, I guess we have quite broad community because people share our values. And this is what we have to stick to. Not only have to, but this is what we like about us. Now we have, 24,000. So another example of what I'm saying is that as of today, around 90% of our budget is coming from small private donations. And there are 24,000 people in Russia who donate us on a monthly basis. And this really empowers us. And this is not only money, but this is the feedback that we get from our society. It is quite important to remember that you work not for you, not because you think that this way to do is better or that way better, not because you are asked by a foundation, not because you are asked to do something because of government, but you have to work in order to reply the demand of the beneficiaries. And the beneficiary, well, in our case, it's political prisoners and those who are detained on mass rallies. So these are the people who we should think of, because we work because of them, and it's quite important to remember this. That's why we run I don't know, quarterly survey in order to ask the feedback, to understand what we should improve. And this is really our basis. And also, I believe that if you compare well, our movement to others, I mean, there are quite a lot of civic society movements in Russia that were established in 90s. So after the fall of Soviet Union, it was several years of freedom, and many civic society movements were established. And unfortunately, they have the same, well, it's been 30 years, and in many cases, they have the same head of this movement, the same employees, the same methods that they apply. But in our case, we saw this, and we see that it is unfortunately outdated. It is not really up to date, and it's not modern, and this is not what always fits. Of course, they are 10 times more experienced than us, but they are not that resilient. And we put a lot of efforts, not only to do our main job to help people, but we put a lot of efforts in developing our organization. So we developed some boards, some consistency, we improve our efficiency, we conduct some, as I said, some surveys to really be an answer to the demand of people who works with us. So we change, for example, I'm not an owner of, I'm not a founder of our organization. However, as of today, I'm general manager. And we have some rules that we change a general manager sometimes. And this is makes us more resilient, and not everyone is in one hand, so we don't put all the eggs into the same basket, and we believe that we should develop some instruments and good governance strategies. So yeah, that's, I guess my 7 minutes is done. So yeah, just to sum it up, I believe that civic society movements should be sticked not to same goals, but to the same values. And this is what makes them sustainable. And I believe that the organization and movements should always think of what your beneficiaries think and to work in order to bring them benefits. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Leonid. Problem-oriented or solution-oriented movements that are focused on the demand of the beneficiaries, that develop new governance methodologies within themselves and adopting new strategies as they evolve. That's the storyline I've taken on board, and everyone has drawn their own conclusions, I'm sure. We have a newcomer, a new panelist that have just joined us, Mr. Philip Gamargellian. But before I give the floor to him, I'd like to ask the same question to Furkan now. Furkan, these grassroots movements, organizations, how are they different from other traditional types of civil society organizations in your experience? Well, these grassroots movements are reactive. And because there comes a point where people say that no more, that's enough, enough is enough. And they want to take initiative. They find themselves in a situation where they have to take initiative. And I think that's the fundamental difference of grassroots movements. And it allows for establishing relations, links, because if I wanted to support a traditional civil society organization on the night of the 1st of February, when the police was attacking the students, I would go to an NGO, civil society organization. I would try to register myself there and try to do something through them. But as an alumni of the Boğaziçi University, I was able to collect data. I still had links and relations with the school, with the professors, and I spontaneously opened up social media accounts and started going for it. And that's what grassroots movements allow us, and that makes them quite comprehensive and inclusive, I think, because it's very clear that they have a line in the sand where they say enough is enough. They meet at that point, and rather than dealing with the technicalities, they are focused on joining forces, on taking action. And I think that's the reason why grassroots movements are receiving such support, and they're making the headlines. And I think they don't have corporate or institutional hurdles either, and that's another important aspect, I think. I don't want to say within the government, but that they're not formed within a bureaucratic structure. Because after a while, I believe that these civil society organizations turn into corporations. They start to have typical and traditional donors and funders, and grassroots movements. These grassroots movements cannot really typically adopt a specific theme or subject to do advocacy on, just as it is the case with the women's rights movements or the detention of students by the police forces. People are trying to draw these issues to different axes, and they're trying to comment on them. They are not trying to establish links or relations with traditional or typical civil society organizations. That's why they're more dynamic, I think, the grassroots movements. And people show themselves, people are more enabled to take action, take initiative. They don't have any links or relations with any association or organization in a traditional sense of the word. And I think that gives them more ample space to maneuver compared to what traditional civil society organizations have, and they have broader room to maneuver. What we experience in Boğaziçi University is that, of course, in Boğaziçi University, years ago, we had a reaction from the students in the face of high prices at the canteen of the university. So in Boğaziçi University, we already had certain structures that raised their voices in the face of such events. But when it comes to the grassroots movements, we had more than 40 initiatives that were doing something together collectively, and you don't need a procedure with grassroots movements. Tomorrow morning, you can wake up and you can start an initiative and spread the word on any platform you want, and you can start your advocacy activities. You can be the parent of an alumni of Boğaziçi University or a student at Boğaziçi University, you would see parents that would seem quite irrelevant to you because they didn't seem like they would be activists there, but they took action because their children were getting arrested and detained. And I think it's quite difficult to observe these kinds of examples with CSOs. They have institutional dynamics which can be flexible, but it wouldn't be something like parents of Boğaziçi University students that start filming themselves one morning, pleading to authorities so that they do not arrest their children. I think this is the very reason why grassroots movements had so much space to evolve and to grow bigger, that room for maneuver. If you are fighting for something, you really have to fight for that thing. You should not waste time dealing with procedures, dealing with institutional structures. And I think this lack of time wasted with grassroots movements makes them more visible and enables them to bring more results to the table. Thank you very much, Furkan. Less hierarchy and open doors in these movements have been very important in your experience. Philip, welcome. Our fourth panelist have just joined us. He's an academic, faculty member. He is Philip Gamargellian. He's working in conflict resolution. And I'd like to start with a question addressing the question to you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And at the outset, everyone has talked about their field of expertise, so to speak. So we tried to think up of a question to ask you. In 2008 in Armenia, newly elected prime minister and the government was opposed, not by an organization per se, but by grassroots movements. We saw a grassroots movement, a series of grassroots movements. How did it all start? If you can tell us very briefly in just 3 minutes, with my apologies, but later on I'll ask you more questions with more time to answer them. Thank you.
Sure, thank you so much, and I apologize for joining a little late. 2018, I guess we are talking about that happened in Armenia. A few points to make. It had an element, the movement had an element of grassroots. But listening to the other speakers now, I don't think it was similar at all. It was actually a very well organized movement. It was organized by a political opposition party, along with a very strong civil society. Eventually, a lot of people joined the movement because the government that was just re-elected, formally at least re-elected, was extremely unpopular. So I think in that case, in my analysis at least, we do not have a grassroots movement the way you are conceiving it in this conversation. It was very much political movement led by a political leader that simply brought out a very big number of the population into the streets. Why it succeeded? For a number of reasons. First of all, a few dynamics came together. That prime minister who was re-elected in 2018 was re-elected only formally speaking, as in through clearly faked elections. And the proof of that, if anything, was that the second election later in 2018, after the movement, showed that that party that just won the majority supposedly in a parliament just a few months back couldn't even cross into parliament. They didn't even get 5% threshold to even become a minority party in the parliament. So that shows that they had absolutely no support. All the numbers were painted essentially, and were absolutely manipulated elections through which they were to come back. So that showed that there was absolute unanimity in the society that this is not a legitimate government. So that allowed a lot of people to come out once there was a challenger. The second reason was that the previous government by Serge Sarkisian, who was re-elected in early 2018, was in government as long as it was, is because that former prime minister, used to be a fighter in that first Karabakh war with Azerbaijan in 1990s. And he had this popularity still remaining of somewhat as a fighter who somehow brought victory and can provide security. So even in 2016, there was another small war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it showed that Armenia will lose the war if the war was to continue. They called the ceasefire pretty quick. That essentially brought this remaining pillar of legitimacy for Sarkisian, the previous prime minister, since he was already unpopular, he was corrupt, and then now he couldn't provide security either. So that seemed to be a matter of time until there would be movement against him. And yet the movement itself was organized again very much by opposition party and civil society organizations, actually NGOs specifically, with a long-standing history of organization. Again, once they were in the streets, then everybody else joined. So, yeah. I think.
Thank you very much. Indeed. So we can conclude that this was a movement rather organized by the opposition party, but it was a civic movement nonetheless, and that is not exactly matching up with what we were discussing earlier, but it does have certain links to what we're discussing, I would say. So there's another question. Because before you joined us, we were also discussing another issue. We have, on the one hand, conventional or traditional civil society organizations. They're more institutional, they have their definitions, vision and mission, and they have less spontaneity, if you like. They may be more influential, but they have little room or less room for maneuvering, if you like. And in recent years, especially, we've seen a lot of grassroots movements that are more spontaneous, and they're taking up more and more space in public life. And we have three important representatives of those grassroots movements with us today who've talked about their own experiences. Now, I'd like to ask you this question because you've been working on conflict resolution and you've been observing conflict resolution all around the world. These kinds of movements do have advantages, but they have their disadvantages as well. How about their protection? Because the state, the government, or the police forces can press down on them more forcefully, if you like. They're more vulnerable in that sense, and these grassroots movements can just cross that fine line of violence sometimes, just because of their lack of structure in that traditional sense. So my question is, what are the problem areas of these grassroots movements, and what are the risks and opportunities of these grassroots movements to contributing social peace? I think a couple of minutes, 3-4 minutes would be sufficient for you to answer the question, hopefully.
So I'm trying to understand, is this, you're asking a general question or from the context of that Armenian movement specifically?
That's more a more general question, but you can use any concrete reference you'd like, of course, but this is a general question.
Yeah, understood. Okay, so I was more prepared to talk about right now the experience in Armenia in 2018 and after. So let me answer that, and then we can maybe talk about more general things. So in that case, right, the movement itself, so once a lot of people came into the streets, which was the case, and they were very decentralized, let's say, there were some groups that attempted to be violent, but because the movement, as I said, was very well organized by an opposition party, they immediately made a public statement that anybody who resorts to violence doesn't belong to the movement, and were able to police that very well, that any group resorting to violence was immediately pushed out of the movement itself and handed to police if needed and so on. So they were able to keep this focus on non-violence. So that overall connects well with the literature on social movements and which ones are more successful. And yeah, if you look into the data over, like, I think 100 to 200 years, the non-violent social movements tend to be more successful in achieving their goals, whether they are political or social, than violent movements. And partially because, of course, violence then is met with violence from the state, and the other movement ends up being in disadvantage. So kind of going with the non-violence route has a tactical advantage, let's say. But it has second big advantage, which is once if the movement is to succeed, if a violent movement succeeds, then we a lot of times have a new form of autocracy or dictatorship. And when a non-violent movement succeeds, politically especially, then we have a much bigger chance of democracy developing. So this was very well known data to the organizers of that particular Armenian movement, which is why they kind of tactically, in addition to any kind of values they had, they resorted to non-violence. There is a whole other part of the question here, though, why government resort or don't resort to violence, if I understood you right. Yeah, again, that's, as we've seen around the world, that's, I think there you might have an inverse effectiveness, as in, unfortunately, a lot of times the violence seems to work better for the governments. If you look into Arab Spring governments, right? So those who resorted to violence tended to actually preserve power, maybe at the expense of unpopularity and autocracy, but they were not deposed. And that's the question, why then governments resort or don't resort to violence. In that particular case in 2018, the hands of the governments were very much tied by a couple of things. One of them was that it was April and was coinciding with the protest times coincided by accident with the 24th of April area, which is the day that Armenians commemorate the genocide, and really pushing army into the streets against the people wouldn't work well for them, let's say, in a long run. That would be a big kind of symbolic problem, which they couldn't do that. So there were a number of reasons, plus they knew how unpopular they are, and they were supposed to advance a peace with Azerbaijan, which was the agreement with prior agreement with Russia and Azerbaijan, so kind of, which meant a lot of concessions from Armenia. So pushing army to the streets, staying in power with force, and then going to compromise with Azerbaijan was a very dangerous move. So a few things came together that resorting to violence would be very dangerous for the sitting prime minister, which luckily in that situation played in the direction of both the government and, as I said, prior to that, opposition, choosing the non-violent struggle, which ended in favor of opposition. So essentially, it's a tactical calculations in my view. Unfortunately, very rarely it's successful strictly on the value-based grounds. But in that case, it worked out. So and it showed that overall, once the movement was chose to go in non-violence route and the government reciprocated in that sense, then the further processes were also dealt with through institutional means. So that is a big argument in favor of non-violence as opposed to violence when it comes to movements.
Thank you very much, Philip. I would like to leave some time for the questions from the participants as well. We have time until 8:30. So the last half hour could be allocated for questions from the participants. So again, I would like to ask all the speakers and give them 7 minutes each once again. And that we can define as interfaces be the new activist structure of civil society. How do you see them working alongside traditional institutional civil society organizations? And do you think, for example, that these initiatives can, so to speak, occupy civic area, the civic space? So what do you think about the future, in short? And again, let's start with Bertha. You have 7 minutes.
Awesome, thank you. I love having 7 minutes because that allows me to expand. What I want to say about the future of it. So my framework sort of for thinking about the future of activism or civil society has a philosophical side, and then it also has a very practical side. So for the philosophical side, it's very much an understanding that our obsession as human beings to create structures and systems, I think is definitionally and fundamentally counter to the model of what is effective activism. What I mean by that is, when we think of what effective activism is, in my experience and in my opinion, it is activism that doesn't conform to traditional ways of doing things. That's what makes it radical, and that's what makes it disruptive. So it is activism that mushrooms organically, and it has a life of its own. It takes on a shape and a design and a form of its own. And that is what sustainable, effective activism is, that defines itself for itself. And then you have us human beings constantly trying to define things and make them make sense to us and give them some kind of order. So it makes no theoretical sense to have sustainable activism as activism that doesn't conform to anything and still want to put it into systems and traditional forms that make it conform to something or any kind of particular definition. And I hope that's clear. And I'm thinking about that specifically because the question is asking us, how do we make it work alongside traditional forms of governance or activism or traditional institutions that seek to bring about some kind of some level of change, right? How do we make that happen? I don't think that if we want to see activism that is has a life of its own and that speaks into the future and that impacts generations to come, I don't think we can do that by trying to define it and by trying to diminish it to systems and orders that make sense for us. So for me, that's my kind of theoretical, philosophical, intellectual engagement with that question. The more practical part is, because unfortunately we do live in a world that does need us to create some kind of order and to classify, I think it's important to respect the sanctity of both the civil society organizations as a collective entity in any country or in any region, as well as the sanctity of government. And I'm talking about government as a stakeholder because that's significant many times. And usually the change that civil society organizations seek to actualize is the kind of change that governance structures and national assemblies and then congresses, etc., have the policy and legislative power to implement. So that's why I'll be focusing on government as a partner stakeholder to activists and civil society. But the bottom line of what I'm saying is practically is we need, and by we, I mean activists as well as government, there needs to be some kind of respect for the duty and the place that is played by both. And let me give a practical example. So during the Shut It All Down protests, like I already mentioned at the beginning, the predominant demographic of young protesters were angry, radical, activist young people. So what that means is that these are young people who are already frustrated by government, who are already angry, and who already feel like they've been failed by traditional systems. That is why they took to the streets. How did that manifest in national dialogue is that it was very difficult to get to a point where you could convince angry young protesting people that reconciliation, conversational reconciliation of some sort and mutual respect is important in order to advance whatever it is we're trying to advance. That meant that on Twitter primarily, you had young people who were insulting government leaders, who were saying very personal, very vile, very ugly things. Young people who were boycotting personalities. Young people who were effectively just cyberbullying major public figures or public leaders because of their anger and frustration. Now, I'm not saying that frustration is not valid, but I am saying you cannot have a conversation in which you expect policy change to come about when you don't and I'm not saying suck up to them, but when you don't respect the role of the people who are to advance the change that you're seeking for. So I think the way that needs to coexist is a mutual respect. And it goes the other way as well, right? Because what we saw also with Shut It All Down is that lots of government leaders and lots of public figures were telling young people that we have no right to be angry because we haven't done anything from a policy point of view, because we haven't been involved with the work yet. And what the question was, what else are you doing other than going to the streets and holding posters and protesting? Those are very unfair questions, and they're very unfair responsibilities and burdens to place on young people who, one, do not have the capacity to advance what they're demanding, but two, also do not have the platforms which they need to be empowered to effect the changes that they're advocating for in the streets. So that disrespect we've also seen from traditional systems where they tell us, but you're just loudmouths, but you don't understand policy, but all you can do is hold posters up in the streets. We think that's something that's significant in itself. So that respect and that mutual recognition or acknowledgement of the sanctity that is being played by both parts, it needs to go both ways if there's some kind of sustainable dialogue going forward. What that means on a conceptual level as well is that as a country, as Namibia, and for other countries as well, it is crucial for any kind of aim, any kind of social justice aim, that civil society, government, as well as other stakeholders moves away from this culture of trying to prove and demonstrate who is doing it better, who has the better way of solving gender-based violence in Namibia. Because that's something that you see many times with any fight for social justice is, but does that really achieve anything? Does that protest achieve anything? Does prayer day achieve anything? Does condemnation achieve anything? The bottom line is there is no one specific event that is going to solve a problem, for example, that's as big as gender-based violence. So what that would mean practically is that we would need lots of different efforts. So we need government, we need civil society, we need prayer for countries that are, that pray. We need all of these things in order for us to achieve any kind of change. So I think moving away from that culture is also the best way. And just as I round up my last minute, that's also really the best way to make sure that civil society moves along to a place that is fruitful and to a place that is prosperous and to a place that gives us the aims that we're trying to achieve. So in a nutshell, that is how I see an ideal future. Right now, in many countries across the world, it looks like nations and dialogue and discourse is very far away from that. But the future that I want to see for activism and social justice is one in which every stakeholder recognizes, respects, and even champions the role and the sanctity and the importance of all other stakeholders in recognizing that whatever aim, whatever ambition is a collective effort, essentially.
Thank you very much, Bertha. That was a very good note. That was a very good speech. Before asking the question to Leonid, I would like to make a little bit of correction. So we're talking about the grassroots movements and civil society organizations, but we're not talking about a substitution, as a matter of fact, or one by the other, but rather we're talking about an expansion of the civic area. So while certain organizations are already there, some new movements are being added onto the civic areas. There are some new inputs coming in, because we have representatives of the traditional organizations as well. So we shouldn't think about it as being confrontational. And you shouldn't understand our question that way as well. So I'm now turning to Leonid. So we see this with the solidarity networks as well. We have volunteers there, obviously in other organizations, we have volunteers as well, but we have sometimes collectives that are formed completely by volunteers, for example, and these interfaces that are created spontaneously. Moving on from your own practical experience, how do you think these new organizations, these new collectives are going to fare in the future? How do you, what role do you see for them? How do you see their future? You have 7 minutes as well.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I wanted to share quite obvious thing, but it's quite important to understand that most of the initiatives are coming after the government prosecutions. I mean, from my perspective, I work with political prosecutions, and our organization were established 10 years ago after the detention because of political repressions. And it was a time when we raised and we are now developing. And it's not only our example. Every time when we see that government or state put a pressure on civic society, then civic society movements are like mushrooms after the rain. They are growing more and more. So that's why I'm quite optimistic. I mean, in Russia, it's quite shrinking civic space, but I believe that the more tough is the pressure, the better its future. That, well, political prosecutions are in the past, but established organizations and collectives, they will be well set, and we'll see their actions in the future. So I believe that that's why I'm quite optimistic about civic society overall. Also, speaking about volunteering, we see that, like, again, speaking about Russia, 30 years ago, it was people involved in civic society were mainly guys who are just so passionate about civic rights, and all they had was their passion, and some of them were becoming professionals, and some of them were just very passionate but not very professional workers. And I believe that if our movements have volunteers who are professionals in their own job, and who can bring some additional value because of their pro bono, and this is what we work on. We have thousands of volunteers, and we try not to give them technical things, but we try to use their professional skills. And I believe, so in Russia, we see this new trend that many people who are quite successful in their business, in their professional paths in very different areas, they are coming to some civic society initiatives. And I believe this is what makes the whole civic society more professional and successful and effective. This is also why I'm quite optimistic. Also, so there is one strange thing that the more, for example, we speak about, in my case, political prosecutions, the more they are visible. And that's why people around think that the quantity, the level of it is also growing. And there are two reasons for it. First of all, it's true that they are growing. The second one is that we disseminate information, and for people, it seems like the problems is bigger, and they think that the situation is going worse, which is not completely true, because in the civic society in the world have learned that each life matters, and each problem is very important that happens to a human. And once, I guess you heard about this guy, Protasevich in Belarus, from the plane. Like, it was just one guy, the whole plane and one guy, and he was detained in a very, crucial way. And the whole world do care about him. And it's great that the whole world can really care about just one person. And this makes all the problems more visible. However, it drives us to the world where there is no problems. There is Steven Pinker. He states, well, a philosopher and writer, he states that now the level of violence is as low as it has never been in our history. Of course, we were in a civic society and we do care about each case of it, and we are quite pessimistic about what's going on. And we see a lot of, well, authoritarian regime, and we see pressure on people, and we see killings, and over social networks you can see all the bad things happening to human rights. However, I believe that this is just because we are now into it. But if you look on a more global level, on dozens of years, I am more optimistic about it. And this is another thing to mention. Well, so we all work with very difficult topics, and there is, well, around me, every day I work with people who were detained, who were tortured, who were I don't know, prosecuted because of their political beliefs. However, it is quite important for all of us, for people who work with such difficult topic, to point out every victory that we do. For example, if someone is sentenced for 1 year instead of 10 years, some people say that it's still very bad, because someone who is not who is accused, who is politically accused of some violation, he is sent to jail. However, I always try to be optimistic and to find to compare not the ideal situation with current situation, but I always try to compare current situation with what could it be if we didn't work. And well, in the example I gave, someone could have been sent to jail for 10 years, but luckily he was sent for just 1 year. And this is a reason to be optimistic. So, yeah, and coming to initial question, I believe that civic society should develop in 2 ways. It couldn't be just volunteer.
It'd be great if you could wrap up soon, Leonid.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So I just wanted to tell that civic society should be built both on volunteer passion and professional experience, and both on formal organization and informal initiatives, and it only works together and not. You shouldn't change one or another. Yes, sorry for me being late.
Thank you very much, Leonid. Now, we will be talking about the future interfaces, future of civil society movements. Over to Furkan. Let me start my timer. Well, to be frank, these grassroots movements do bear certain risks because they're fully based on individual initiatives, personal initiatives. And at the end of the day, as I said earlier, people are brought together based on a message, and they fight for the sake of that message. And that's a very basic, fundamental message that brings together a lot of different people. What we've witnessed with Boğaziçi University movement is that these messages are disseminated in an uncontrolled manner through various platforms and individuals, and that brings about, that gives birth to some negative consequences as well. These organized or unorganized structures try to meet on certain platforms that would make them more structured. And what these civil society organizations, current civil society organizations, offer is basically their their past experiences, and these experiences, I think, will make the future more meaningful to the extent that they can meet with these grassroots movements on different platforms. These structures have some problems in terms of the procedural structures they have, and I think these grassroots movements may have some spontaneous contributions, but if they can be structured or designed in a more acceptable manner, I think we can see better civil society organizations in the future. And it is also very, very important today to what extent these movements can be structured on digital platforms. Yes, we do see a lot of civil society organizations that are institutionalized, and they cannot act very fast, as rapidly as the grassroots movements. And I believe that we may need new solutions, maybe, to make them more efficient, to make them act more swiftly. The struggle that is going on with Boğaziçi University has been archived by certain civil society organizations. They're trying to give added value to the grassroots movements or movement of Boğaziçi University, and that's very meaningful. I think in the future, civil society organizations will become more flexible and they will become more inclusive. That's at least my dream, how I dream of the future. They will become more important, more relevant, and the efforts to convince the general public will become more easier. And there's a very good example, the example of Greta Thunberg, if I'm pronouncing her family name correctly. She was fighting for climate change, trying to raise awareness about climate change. And that example is an excellent one to show how an individual initiative can turn into a true civil society organization. Maybe we will start to see more and more of these kinds of civil society organizations that actually come from grassroots movements. Maybe these grassroots movements will turn into civil society organizations, turn into proper structures. In that sense, their contribution to the existing movements are very important, and redesigning their models, their structures are also will also be very important, I think, for the future. To go back to my example of Boğaziçi University movement, it is not possible at all for any CSO to be part of this movement because it is not a legal entity. We cannot really talk about an NGO or a CSO that can represent Boğaziçi University students. For women's rights, yes, you can talk about it. You can set up a civil society organization and work on women's rights policies. On the other hand, with Boğaziçi University, we have stakeholders, a lot of stakeholders, because Boğaziçi University is quite a prominent one. There are students and their parents that are involved in this, but they cannot really meet on a platform that is a legal entity at the same time, because the school itself is a legal entity. And I think the grassroots movements and civil society organizations will open up space for each other's existence. I cannot really think of any other possibility. I think no CSO can represent Boğaziçi University. Of course, they can support the movement, but only the true representatives of the university, the academics, the students, the parents, can resolve this issue, because they are they're directly involved in this. And I believe that a lot of different groups, a lot of different stakeholders, women, LGBTI, and Boğaziçi University students may share the same problem. They might be fighting for democracy against the current government, but when it comes to the feasibility and practicalities, I think we need a solution that is based on shared structures. That is why it makes more sense to me to have the CSOs take the back seat here, because the subject of the phenomenon or the those that are directly involved in the phenomenon might be difficult to bring together under a single roof. And grassroots movements have no specific bylaw or statute that gives them more structure. That's why they're more flexible and more inclusive in that sense. And maybe they can set up their own platforms and somehow come together on those platforms with different collectives, different networks. They can create spaces to meet. And that's what I was referring to earlier when I was talking about digitalization. Maybe they can create an online platform, bringing together all of the individual initiatives that support them. They can create broader platforms, or more like an umbrella platform that will bring those individuals together and help them raise their voices louder. And I think in the future, they may find more common space, more partnership opportunities. Thank you very much, Furkan. And I'm going back to Philip again, and I'd like to formulate the question as follows. But of course, you're free to answer the question in any way you wish. You're working on conflict resolution, and I myself have dabbled in those themes as well in Colombia, in Turkey, in South Africa, in Armenia. We've always heard of various actors in various conflicts. These may be religious people, these may be politicians or organization leaders. So here's my question. These grassroots movements, do you think they can have any function in conflict resolution, whether today or sometime in the future? Or conflict resolution, do you think it is still an institutional matter? That's my question.
Thank you.
You have 7 or 8 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, it's an important question. And yeah, listening to the other speakers was really interesting to see so the optimism that Leonid was in a civil society in a traditional sense, as NGO-based, institutionalized, that Leonid was talking about. And Furkan, I believe, was more talking about networks. So it's interesting because for the last 30 years, we had it easy in a way. It was very clear what the institutional network is, right? So there was liberal democracy. It was for Turkey and all the post-Soviet space. Somewhat it was European integration. It was very clear direction where we're going. We were, so this kind of final state of the way state should look like, civil society should look like, was very clear. We were following a blueprint. The donors were clear, right? So it was funding coming from the European or American governments and similar. So all of this had some benefits, of course. Some of them Leonid mentioned. It was that it was institutionalized. There was much more about money, blueprint, support in skill building and so on, coming from the Western partners, those who did that already. It also had, the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of downsides. As we saw, some of it that we were ended up as civil society organizations following and fulfilling a particular, very narrow agenda. And in some cases it was good, such as it was focused on human rights, right, and overall promoting the life and well-being of an individual. At the same time, not all the agendas coming from the West were, of course, good ones, and we've seen problematic, many problematic, imperialist agendas servicing the interest of the oil lobby or what other lobby, and by default essentially being in that camp, ideologically, you were servicing these agendas as well. But that's on a global scale. Locally, that also had a consequence that is not necessarily good. If in the 90s there were a lot of grassroots movements in many of the countries that were democratizing, once the NGO sector took over, and I'm a representative of NGO for 15, 20 years, so I'm as critical of myself here as anybody. I still run an NGO too, actually. But once NGOs took over, they effectively killed the grassroots movements, at least in the countries such as most of the post-Soviet ones, where this liberal democracy was seen as the ideal form towards what we are going. The way we killed grassroots activism was were many different ways. First of all, we took on all the main functions, be it social functions or functions such as conflict resolution. And we were more visible. We were better educated. We had better connections to the West and the key institutions in the governments in the cities. They also one by one took out all the activists from their grassroots, those most important leading ones, and employed them effectively in our NGOs, by default, then by definition or by extension, killing all the movements that could have been developing in different regions, more on the border areas, for example, that could be collaborating with somebody if you had a conflict and so on. So this kind of NGOization, which has been already quite heavily criticized in academic literature, had this double function of, yes, professionalizing, yes, advancing some agendas, very particular agenda, at the same time killing the grassroots activism. What happens now is that we are essentially that liberal democracy dominance, of course, has collapsed. It's still fighting for its life. It's one of the movements or one of the ideologies in the world, but it's one of the, it's not anymore the one. And we are entering a new interesting era, kind of similar to 100 years ago, in the sense that there is a big ideological struggle happening. But I think different from 100 years ago, there are no new big ideas on the table. We are really fighting ideologically some old struggles. And that is a problem, in my view. At the same time, we have something interesting happening, which is, of course, the social media that Furkan mentioned, right? So it's a very new type of communication environment. So coming then to the next part of the question, as in what's the future here, I think civil society organizations understood as NGOs will have a small role, nothing like they had for the last 20 years, because the liberal democracy is one of the ideologies around. So to the extent liberal democracy is able to have a say or remain institutionalized, to that extent will be civil society organizations understood as NGOs. But this opens up also a space for networks and intellectual networks, and intellectuals again understood not in a traditional way, in a sense. It's an academic, right? So it's a very well-published academic. Hopefully we will have some role as well. But Greta's example was great. So there were a lot of like social media influencers, right? So people passionate with good ideas, with very deep thoughts that are able to kind of catalyze and use well these new tools of communication that then create a movement. So that's very much clearly is a direction. That has a big benefit compared to civil society, again, understood as NGO, again, similar to what Furkan was saying. It doesn't have an organization. It doesn't have a registration somewhere that the government can arrest, or a bank account, or somehow arrest a leader, right? It's a movement that is based in internet. And that is also by definition a transnational one, because you don't necessarily depend anymore on a person next door, right? So you can connect with somebody in Sweden or South Africa or Colombia and so on, and continue pushing for the same cause. So these ones, I think, were much more resilient in the last 5 to 10 years, and much more resilient and resisting to crackdowns from the authoritarian governments. And I do believe they have a very big future, somewhat in competition with more traditional building-based registered NGOs, but possibly also taking us into a new place ideologically, as in once we think about this new big idea of what the next stage of human development in terms of social organization look like as we move past, at some point, the nation state, which is in its own in crisis. The final note about the conflict resolution, does it have a role or not in all of this? As an applied field, it's in a big crisis because it followed the same liberal democratic blueprint, and that's falling apart. But as an intellectual movement, it's been much deeper, and there has been a lot of anticipation of all the problems coming. So if you look into the conflict resolution conversation as a multidisciplinary critical one, I think it does have a lot to say about where we are. Disagree with Leonid's point, and and I know it's a big intellectual one, that we're in a good place because the definition of violence, the structural and cultural and so on, is much broader. So yes, maybe physical violence is in this low end right now, but the kind of structural violence is probably at its peak and is developing. So it has a lot to say about where we are and where we can potentially move forward, but that's a much longer conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, indeed. This has been a very satisfying answer, indeed. Now, we've listened to our panelists. We've heard about their experiences, about their opinions. We have now half an hour left. Bearing in mind the time we have left, I'd like to... I think not. Please go ahead. First and foremost, as the president of the Violence-Free Society Association, I'd like to offer my greetings and love and affection to each and every one of you. This is not just one of the best events organized by Hrant Dink Foundation. This has been one of the best experiences I've had in my life. At the association, we're fighting for the rights of the women and mothers at national and then at global level. And we are suggesting that they should get organized, first of all, in their own countries, and then at continental level, and then at global level, just like the structures we see in the UN. Eliminating gender-based violence, gender-based discrimination in the future can only be possible through women's movement, mothers' movement that will be accompanied and supported by men. If we can accomplish that, I think we will see no more wars, conflicts, armed or non-armed conflicts in the world. And I would like to offer a different perspective to what Furkan has shared earlier. These kinds of movements, whether or not they're supported by grants, should be maintained. And if they organize any program in the future about organizations at all, as their elder and as a journalist that has spent his life working on this, I'd like to offer my contribution and a big thank you to the moderator. The salt and pepper hair looks very good on you, and you've moderated the question very well, indeed. And I'd like to hug you all, and I'd like to, I see Philip smiling at the moment, big kisses to him as well. Thank you. Thank you all. That's it from me. That was a very motivational speech indeed. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? You can simply unmute yourself. I think the panelists' remarks were quite satisfying, and you found answers to all of your doubts in your minds and all of your burning questions, I assume. Extremely, extremely satisfying indeed, to be frank with you, and a really big thank you to each and every one of them for giving us this experience. And I see Esra smiling as well. I think she felt the same. Let me then ask a question to Bertha, first of all, as per usual. You've had a very important experience in Namibia. That was a spontaneous movement that has created its own system, so to speak. And where there was a problem, you focused on that problem, you focused on solving that problem, and you actually managed to solve the problem at hand. Can this be translated into a model? For example, those who are working in this field in Turkey or in Armenia or in Greece, what lessons should they draw from your experience in principle and in technical terms, maybe?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the question. So one, I do want to preface it by saying I don't think we've solved the problem. So Namibia is still very much in a gender-based violence pandemic / femicide, and we probably won't see a solution to the problem even in our lifetime. I do think what we have done quite well, if I do say so myself, is we've injected in a renewed sense of urgency into the movement, into the conversation, and into the efforts around gender-based violence. And for technical kind of framework as well, which is important, is that so there have been a lot of efforts by government that have been re-accelerated, revamped, or renewed. So, for example, the establishment of gender-based violence courts, the introduction of a sex offenders registry, but there's been a lot of technical successes, the renewed training of police officers, etc. But to answer your bottom line question, some of the lessons that we've learned, one, I think the most important one for us to really understand was using your heart and your courage and your audacity as a young person, not or as anyone really, to kind of contribute to efforts, right? So, and this ties into to what I've said earlier. So many times what we do is we try to define things and movements and structures and systems. What Shut It All Down did was we said, what do we feel like doing? And that's why we organized a protest of about 1,000 people within a period of 24 hours. We said, what do we want to do? We said, we want to shut down white monopoly capital. We want to shut down Zoo Park. We want to shut down the police station. So what are we going to do? We're going to send out emails and call people, and we did it. We didn't think too much about it. And it's also important to say, I think, so Shut It All Down won an award from the African Union of $5,000 to continue their efforts as well. But all of those successes are really young people saying, what do we feel like doing? And then just doing it. And I think that is a successful model, because many times we ask ourselves, lots of technical questions that are important for planning and administrative purposes, but they're not important for the objective of what you're trying to get to, which is really appealing to the hearts of people to solve a problem.
All right, Bertha, you have another question coming for you. Do you think your movement became an source of inspiration for other movements in your country in any way at all? That's a question from a member of the audience.
Hi, thank you. Definitely. So what we've seen is after Shut It All Down, there was a mushrooming and a beginning of lots of other different movements, and not just for gender-based violence, but for other things as well. So after we protested, we saw that, for example, students were protesting because the university fees were too high. Tomorrow, in fact, there's a protest in front of a political school of the ruling party to protest against homophobia in Namibia. We've seen protests even from the tourism and the hospitality industry because there were so many negative financial impacts from COVID-19. So we've seen a lot of other protests. In fact, we just ended a protest where the national broadcasting station in the country, the members were in a nationwide protest because they didn't have fair working conditions. And I will say that Shut It All Down played a significant role in reminding people of their power to advocate and to speak and to hold government to account.
Right, thank you, Bertha. Now, a question for Philip from the chat box, actually. It was asked in English. Philip asked for a clarification on the question. I couldn't quite figure out what is the question exactly, but what I understand is that the question is the following. Social movements are non-violent in principle, but while they are happening, they can create violence in one way or another. How do you look at that is the question, I think, unless the attendee who asked the question would like to expand it further. I have a few questions for the other panelists as well, but before that, let me give the floor to Philip to give an answer.
Yeah, there was a clarification. The question was, how do you manage to keep as an organizers, how do you manage to keep the movement non-violent? Essentially, how do you control, let's say, those who try to resort to violence? well, of course, you can't fully control, right? So that's if you are a movement, and especially decentralized movement, you can control every action. In that experience, I thought was when very well organized, the one I mentioned in Armenia a couple of years back. They made a very clear early and public announcement that we are a non-violent movement, and anybody resorting to violence essentially doesn't belong to the movement, and continued to repeat this all the time. Yeah, so this was kind of the main line in almost every talk, that this is non-violent movement. It's so do not resort to violence. Whoever resorts to violence, then we are against you as much as we are against the government. And that was, and they specifically within initial organizers, there was one of the movements that was one of an organization, rather a political party, that was advocating for violence. So the others immediately cut them out, saying, okay, we are not partnering up with this particular group. And then it became kind of self-policed in a sense. Once somebody was resorting to violence, the people around were saying, okay, you are not with us anymore, and would, again, just get this person and hand them to police or something like that. So in that particular case, yeah, there was a lot of emphasis put into rhetorically from the day one, emphasizing we are non-violent, right? So once there is a police, raise your hands, kind of, go to jail, don't resort to violence, let alone don't initiate it, don't even reciprocate, right? So that seemed to work. Yeah, I think that's kind of very clear line of this is who we are and we are not resorting to violence, at least in that experience, helped.
Furkan, I have a question for you, as a matter of fact. So the Bosphorus University protest has expanded, as a matter of fact, and there are political objections as well. For example, the appointment of a director by the government, and also the people are demanding to protect their human rights. There was that kind of a value chain in the protests there as well. So there are different layers of it. Have you seen sort of, for example, sort of concentration of political affiliation among those layers, or differentiation between certain people? Okay, I should say this. So we have a conservative regime in Turkey at the moment, and it seems like any action taken by the government at the moment is also something that the conservatives of the country would agree with. But we have, as a matter of fact, many conservative students in the Bosphorus University as well. Therefore, under this very comprehensive sort of roof, there was a reconciliation attempt as well. For example, we have a group of Muslim students in the Bosphorus University. The Bosphorus family at one point sort of cancelled that group, but then those Muslim students established another group. Obviously, because of the layers expanding, there could be certain frictions there, but still the students, the graduates, the parents, all of them did everything they can so that the main message was there. For example, establishing their own groups. A lot of Muslim students at the moment have also a voice against what the government is doing as well. There was that kind of solution, for example, that developed. Obviously, this resistance has a political side as well, but generally it talks about the independence of universities, the right to education. It was simply about that. Therefore, no political affiliation was allowed. As a matter of fact, no direct political affiliation was allowed. But all political ideas, in a way, lived harmoniously. And that is what we had in the Bosphorus University anyway, that that is what we have in the Bosphorus University at the moment, a multiplicity of different views. And that is what they're trying to achieve at the moment as well. And we are trying to show with the establishment of different initiatives that we have this multiplicity of views and all of them are respected in the Bosphorus University. Yes, that is what I meant basically. Because there's a lot of politicization of everything in Turkey at the moment because against the authorization, that is what I meant. So Leonid, in Russia, the government can be quite tough and there could be a lot of persecution against human rights advocates, against bloggers. You probably have experienced that kind of persecution as well. So how does that affect your civil values? When you live in a country, for example, it could be Russia, it could be Turkey, when you live in that kind of a culture, how does that impact your civil values? Do you encounter any problems in sort of experiencing those values?
So, of course, technically, government prosecute not only political activists, which were really a target for our state for many years. But these years, they have started prosecuting also human rights defenders. Not as tough as they do with political forces, opposition political forces, but with us as well. Fortunately, our organization hasn't yet faced any direct pressure, and we are keep developing, and it's also a paradox with us that the worse situation in Russia, the more political prosecutions there are, the more, for example, donations and support and volunteers we got. That's why we're in a quite strange position, because we are always, well, our own situation, well, the situation of my organization is always going the different directions. So if the situation is worse, we're doing more and more well. But of course, I mean, I believe that every pressure on civic society, every prosecution of political activists or whoever, it is always a strike for us, for civic society, and we're luckily for doing so. Our response is always better, is always more resilient than the pressure of the government. It won't always be like this. I mean, at some point of time, we can follow our, Belarus, and where unfortunately civic society, the state, the level of prosecution were that high that civic society can hardly respond to them. But as of today in Russia, I mean, everything can change tomorrow. You never know, but as of now, we are more or less able to respond to some challenges. Of course, I mean, so of course there are problems. Of course, people are now being sentenced to jail, and it is quite obvious problems. But another, speaking about values and civic values, when the pressure of the government is that high, many people who believe, I mean, for example, me and my organization, we work with human rights and we are not affiliated with any political force. But once the pressure on the whole civic society is growing, then people who are human rights defenders, they are going more radical. And some of them can switch from human rights values to political values, and they sometimes switch where they are transferring from defending human rights and they are going to fighting with the current regime, with Vladimir Putin, and this is how they can lose values. And for example, I always, during the interview, when I want to hire something into my organization, I always ask what our organization would do when Vladimir Putin, well, something happens to him and he's no more president. And if someone tells me that our mission is complete, at that point, I say no, unfortunately, so we have different values and different goals, because we want to fight for human rights, no matter who is now a president of Russia or whoever. And so it's quite important not to mix up the real values and the current political situation and the leader. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Leonid. So we have come to the end of it now. This has been a very nice panel, in my opinion. We have listened to very important speeches. We would love to have more time, obviously, but we have to come to an end. This has to come to a conclusion. I'd like to conclude by saying that obviously the grassroots movements have a lot of value because this has a bottom-up approach. And generally, they're more egalitarian, they're more democratic. They include civilian values, civil values. And they are generally problem-focused as well. They are built on solidarity networks and they have a high rate of volunteers. And obviously, as civil values are protected in these movements, then we have also the concept of rebuilding the civic space. And these movements have a lot of importance in that regard as well. Maybe the political scientists may say afterwards, for example, that this is the foundational movements for new oppositions to be built. Despite all the hegemonic approaches by the governments, these grassroots movements can give a lot of hope to people. So today we talked about these grassroots movements and we wanted to see them from the inside, as a matter of fact, with our participants, with our speakers. Thank you very much for your participation. I believe that this has been a very nice panel. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Hrant Foundation as well. And I give the floor to Ebru. Can you give me 30 seconds? So first of all, thank you very much, Philip. I would like to thank everybody, but